Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining. I'm Lourdes Calderon, ESG Manager at EPRA, the European Public Real Estate Association. I'm very pleased to open today's session where we are presenting our new white paper looking at how EPCs and ZEB are being implemented following the EPBD recast from last year. You can access the report via the QR code that you see in the screen, and also the slides with the report will be available in the chat. So next slide, please. The report is the result of a close collaboration of EPRA with KPMG. A big thank you to everyone who contributed to the report. And today, two members of the KPMG team are here with us. Francesca Galeazzi, Partner in Real Estate Advisory and Sustainability, and Janine Schuler, Senior Manager in Real Estate Advisory and Sustainability. They have been a key part to this project, and I am really looking forward to hearing their thoughts later on. Next slide, please. So here there is a quick look at what we will be covering today. I will start setting the scene and giving some background on how this report came to be. And then I will hand over to KPMG to dig deeper into the report. And they will provide an overview of the 2024 EPBD recast, the main insights from the white paper, and the current status quo of the implementation of the ZEB and EPCs in different member states. We will provide also a small summary, and we will give at the end like 10-15 minutes for your questions. However, you can actually send them through the Q&A section at any point during the webinar. Next slide, please. Next one. Okay, so let's kick off. As many of you know, EPRA is a membership-based association. We represent the interest of the listed real estate sector in Europe, mainly listed real estate companies and investors. Hence, one of our key roles is engaging in policy work on behalf of the sector, and we closely monitor legislative development. We respond to public consultation from the European Commission, Platform on Sustainable Finance, EFRAG, among others. So we are voicing the industry perspective to ensure the regulation is both ambiguous and feasible for the real estate sector. Once the legislation is in place, we support our members in navigating the different regulations, helping them to better understand the implication, timelines, and implementation requirements. As you can see in the slide, the big green, previous slide, please. As you can see in the slide, the green chart, the green circles are all the different regulations that have been popping up during the last 6 to 7 years in Europe. Those are main key regulations on Europe that are affecting the real estate sector. However, EPRA decided to focus only on the 4 that you can see in the smaller circle. And one of the regulations is the EPBD. Next slide, please. And why did we choose the EPBD? Because this regulation is specifically focused for the real estate. It directly targets the building of our members and is the main European legislative tool to improve energy performance. So it covers existing and new buildings. It supports the European long-term climate objective with the ultimate goal of cutting energy consumption, reducing emission, and achieving net zero building stock by 2050. As you can see in the second part of the slide, and as you probably know, the EPBD is not new. It was in place in 2002, and it has gone through several updates. The last one was approved last year in 2024, well, in May 2024, and it introduced plenty of new requirements. Next slide, please. So, among all the new requirements that the EPBD 22 recast introduced, we focus on the energy performance certificates and the new requirements that try to establish a more harmonized and comparable EPC system across Europe, and introduces the zero emission building standard, which is going to replace the nearly zero energy building standard. And why these 2 points among the rest? Because in these two aspects, the European Commission define common goals. However, it gives a lot of freedom to member states in the implementation of these topics. And actually, this can lead to more inconsistencies and increased complexity across the markets if it's not done properly. And these topics are especially relevant for our members, those that have cross-continental portfolios, and for investors seeking greater transparency, comparability, and alignment with EU climate targets. Specifically, the EPCs affect asset valuation, sustainability disclosures, and access to green financing. On the other hand, the new zero-emission building definition will influence CapEx planning, key within real estate companies' development, and is also going to affect their strategies. Then, aligning fast in these points, it will strengthen investor confidence, and it can improve financing conditions and the overall resilience and competitiveness of real estate portfolios. Next slide, please. Yes. Also, important to be aware of the goal of this white paper. So we just wanted to provide a clear of the current situation of the implementation of these two topics across member states, because as you know, the general implementation deadline is May 2026, so in 1 year. So we wanted to see where different countries stand, which gap exists in meeting the different expectations, which are the strategic opportunities that are available in the market. And we also included in the last section a summary of the latest guidance that the European Commission published last 30 of June regarding these two topics. So it's just a small summary of this new guidance. And with this, I'm very pleased to hand over to Francesca Gagliassi from KPMG, who will present the report in more detail. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lourdes, for the great introduction. We are really excited about this white paper because we think it's going to be a big changer for our industry. Before we dive into the content of the research, I would like just to say that this research was done collaboratively with our colleagues in KPMG Poland, led by Monika Debska-Pastakia. And this has been a great collaboration. We were able to cover a lot of aspects of different countries, different perspectives, and had a great collaboration and dialogue with EPRA. Well, let's now go into the white paper. Next. And next again. We want to give you first an overview of the EPBD in general, and then we will dive into the content of the two topics of the EPBD that we have been analyzing in more detail. So first of all, we want to provide this overview of what are the major changes that we will expect. As we know, European directives have 2 years to be implemented into national law. So we will also see how different countries will implement the different criteria of the directive and how they will interpret the requirements, the indications, and also what level of flexibility they will keep. So let's start from top right. We're going in order around clockwise. First of all, we'll see minimum energy performance standards required for non-residential and residential buildings. For non-residential buildings, what is critical to understand is coming to us will be the mandatory renovation of what's called worst performing buildings. And the EPBD requires a 16% renovation by 2030 and 26% by 2033 for non-residential buildings. We will have to see how countries will translate this, whether it's going to be on primary energy demand or on EPC classes. What's clear, though, that this would be a major game changer because renovation waves are currently stagnating. They're far behind the 2 to 3% a year rates required to achieve a carbon neutral building sector by 2050. So this is the first step of a progressive renovation of the existing non-residential building stock in all countries. On the other hand, also residential buildings would be renovated along the lines of national renovation plans, so a bit less. The formulation is a bit different. It's not mandatory worst performing building renovations. It's also very political renovation of the residential building stock. But we also see very clear thresholds for minimum renovations by certain years emerging from the EPBD. Next, we also see the solar energy deployment on roofs, so namely photovoltaics and solar hot water, and with requirements of new buildings to be solar ready for particular building typologies, and then progressively over the years for all buildings. We also have requirements for renovation passports for buildings and for national building renovation plans to be put forward to the European Commission to demonstrate that countries, member states, have plans to renovate the entire building stock. The next major influence that we see coming from the EPBD is the gradual elimination of fossil fuel for heating, so boilers mainly, for heating and hot water, with subsidy bans already starting this year, and with the idea of a full phase out by 2040. Consider that the majority of the carbon emissions in buildings are caused by residential heating. This is a major issue that has to be tackled in Europe. And now the next two steps, that are the major focus of our white paper, is the zero emission building standards. So the introduction of a ZEB standard for all new construction. The EPBD says new buildings must be zero emission buildings from 2030, putting more pressure on public buildings to do that already by 2028. And finally, the reform of the EPC systems with an harmonization of the scales. As we know, and we will see in detail later, at the moment it's very difficult to compare performance of European portfolios. The scales are different, the requirements are different, the units that are used are also different. This is extremely difficult, also in our practical experience, to be able to understand what's going on across a European portfolio. Now the harmonization will bring that much needed clarity across how EPCs are calculated and published for buildings across Europe, with a requirement for digital EPCs. They are publicly accessible. And also they not only provide energy consumption of buildings, but also introduce greenhouse gas emissions, introduce roadmaps for decarbonization, and possibly also other information points. These ZEB requirements and EPCs are closely linked because a zero emission building has an energy performance certificate of A. So the two are always to be considered together. Let's have a look at the details a bit more. So we have focused in our study on those two aspects, zero emission buildings, because they will really influence, have a direct impact on development pipelines, also how new buildings are designed and specified. They would probably have a direct implication on asset valuations, also because the European taxonomy and valuation practices have an element of performance and linking also back to the zero emission standard and the EPCs value, and also how operational practices would be impacted in that actual energy performance of buildings will need to be included in EPC ratings. And also managing a zero emission building will require constant monitoring of energy performance, digitalization. So the key features of a zero emission building, as we were already starting to see earlier, is the not having a on-site fossil fuel emission and therefore only the use of on-site or nearby renewables, for example, linking the building to energy communities or district heating systems. Zero emission buildings are very high performance buildings that have only small energy demand covered by non-fossil fuel energy sources. Zero emission buildings, as I mentioned, must achieve an EPC class of A, and to be at least, the recommendations of the Commission, of the European Commission, is to be at least 10% below NZEB standards. As we said, public buildings would need to be designed and built to be ZEB by 2028, followed by all the other non-residential buildings by 2030. As we know, in the construction world, it takes quite a few years for buildings to be built from the moment they start to be planned. So public planning buildings would need to start to do that already right now. Right? And then post 2030, the goal is to achieve a emission-free or a carbon-free built environment by 2050. So the ZEB requirements would come into force also for existing buildings, with a gradual approach where building renovations need to happen along the line of the building renovation plans, published by all member states. And we will see a lot of more focus and effort, and possibly also funding schemes and support for the gradual renovation by 2040 and by 2050 of the entire building stock. And again, as we see in the next slide, again, a lot of more requirements on the EPCs along the lines of this gradual transformation of the entire building stock. This is extremely important. EPCs are basically the passport of how buildings perform. They're used in sales or transactions or rental agreements, and therefore would be extremely important. And more with this harmonization. First of all, the scales would be harmonized with the standard A to G rating. And we've seen that across Europe, some countries have AAA or have ratings worse than G. So this entire harmonization that will need to happen by 2026, by May next year, is a very important and significant change into how buildings would be evaluated. Also consider when a EPC would be redone in the future, what's now a B, or a C, so a good performing building might fall into a worse performing category, triggering a renovation requirement. So watch this space. We also said there's a Class A is a zero emission building. Class G is a worst performing building. So it's the first ones that would need to be renovated. Watch out for your portfolios that already have buildings in Class G. And it's also an optional Class A plus for buildings which are way better than zero emission building standards, possibly at least 20% better than ZEBs. We also have the introduction of greenhouse gas emissions requirements in the EPC indicators, and also the mandatory indication of renovation measures, so decarbonization and energy efficiency measures with their estimated energy savings and carbon savings. Also, what is important is that member states will need to have fully digitalized and publicly available national EPC databases for transparency, and also for member states to be able to identify exactly those buildings that will need to be renovated, either by number of buildings or by square meters. So as you can see, quite a lot of changes coming to the EPC system. As we were about to publish our white paper, just a couple of days ago, the Commission published an implementation supporting guidance with a package of documentation for member states and for working groups to be able to unpack some of their requirements. So I really welcome all of you that are interested to understand what are the implications of the entire EPBD on your portfolio, whether it's for new developments or for existing buildings, to start to look at those guidance, because there's a lot of more clarity across all those aspects that we mentioned before. So I'm not going to mention all the information of the package, but just to say that this has been published on the 30th of June and provides a lot of information for you to access. Next. What we see is a series of implications for the real estate sector that I started already to mention as we started the discussion, but just to summarize them, we see 5 key implications for you. First of all, watch out for the zero emission building standards as the standard for new construction, because it really requires the alignment of your design briefs, of your construction practice, of materials, of the way buildings are designed and operated along the side of digitalization, measuring performance in operations to meet the new ZEB requirements. So this is a major uplift of an existing NZEB standard that would really influence how buildings are designed, allowed, so the entire permitting from authorities, and also technical specification and standards. Buildings would be much more fully electrified in the future, right? So electrified, digitized, and with renewable energy powering them. So a real transformation of the sector. Second, and really critical, is the mandatory renovations of worst performing buildings. As we said, 16% by 2030, 26% by 2033. This is basically tomorrow in building terms. So how are we as a sector start to understand what buildings are already likely to fall into those requirements would be important to prepare. So members of EPRA with large portfolios, but also building owners, really to start to understand what is the risk for your buildings. And we believe that impacted are pretty much every sectors and the majority of building categories, especially energy intensive buildings. So older office and residential buildings that were built, say, in the 80s or pre-80s, before requirements for insulation, thermal insulation. if they haven't been already renovated, but also hospitals and clinics, logistic buildings and warehouses, industrial manufacturing facilities. Often clients have very large sites that have been growing over time, over the years, with buildings of varying energy performances. Those are priorities, but also pharmaceutical, retail, supermarket, schools and universities, sports facilities. As you see, a lot of buildings could be impacted. Third, as we discussed, the harmonization and digitization of EPC ratings and start to prepare for better reporting requirements, but also marketability of your assets, and possibly a direct link between EPC and asset value. We definitely see that that would be the case. The phase out of fossil fuels is also a very important aspect. So buildings will need to be electrified going forward or connecting to district energy systems. And this is a very important requirement, because retrofitting a heat pump into a building is not that straightforward. So electrification would be a key and would be extremely important to think about how your assets would need to be planned for that phase out. And finally, as a consequence of the entire transformation of the EPC systems and the various requirements of the directive, is the direct impact on portfolio strategy and portfolio value. We see a lot, an increased risk in the risk of stranding of assets and the devaluation, because of the complexity and the costs of those retrofits, of the electrification required, and then the market requiring buildings to have a good performance, say class A, B, or maximum C for the next decade. So this is a risk for portfolio managers, and they will need to start to think how to communicate it to their leadership and how to start to plan for budgets. So having said that, let's look a little bit more what we did in our white paper. In the next slide, the what, the why we did. Well, the why I think is pretty clear by now, and also how we did it. The next slide shows an introduction and the link to our white paper that you can now download on your on the EPRA website. Is ready for access. As we said, is fully focused on ZEB standards and EPCs. Just for clarity, you would not find here other requirements, but we decided to focus on those two aspects. We think they have a real direct impact on existing portfolios, and to give you also an update of what is going on at the moment in the European member states that are preparing for taking the EPBD into the national law. We have to say that it was very hard to find information. It was a lot of the working groups that are ongoing at the moment, both at national level and European level. They are working behind closed doors. It was very hard to access information. We did it through interviews and through publicly available information, but we believe that there would be quite a lot of new updates coming to the market in the next months, possibly autumn or winter, just ahead of the publication by May 2026. So there's only a few months to go. And there's already still quite a lot of uncertainty about what is going on in the member states. So how do we do it? How do we overcome that uncertainty and the lack of transparency and information that we encountered? In the next slide, we show you how we work together with EPRA to overcome that. So our methodology was basically consisting of several steps. First of all, a thorough research across all 27 member states to try to understand how far they were, what information was available at national and European level on the implementation of the EPBD. We were looking for information on the harmonization of the EPC system, any discussions, any papers published, but also any information on how the transformation of the ZEB standards was going to be included into national law, whether any countries were already talking about not being able to do that by May 2026. And as I already mentioned, there was very, very little research available, mainly at at European level and few national documents. So we complemented that research with interviews with key stakeholders, namely green building councils, both the World Green Building Council and national green building councils, also national trade bodies, and we also interviewed a few property companies that we felt were more engaged and ahead and had a better feeling, possibly also participating to some of those working groups. After those two steps, we still had a major gap in the analysis. What we decided then to do is to assess the alignment of the member states with the current today's national legislation for EPCs and ZEB standards to the new requirements of the EPBD. And then you could start to see that some countries already had, say, a harmonized EPC system, scale A to G, and providing certain information that was very close to what the EPBD requires, or they had NZEB standards very close to the ZEB requirements or recommendations. So those member states would be much closer to be able to meet their requirements by May. And so we started to compare to others. They have a non-harmonized scale. Their buildings' performance is very far from recommended benchmarks, thresholds by the EU, and therefore we could see a potential difficulty for those states to meet the requirements. And we developed a very clear and transparent, for all of you to see, point-based system to try to evaluate which countries are ahead and which ones are behind. And so we wanted to provide something that is a guidance of the entire harmonization system, and an implementation system in the member states, very transparent, point-based, where you can clearly see with a lot of documentation information how we did the analysis. And therefore, very clearly, the limitations is that there's still very little publicly available documentation. There's a widespread lack of transparency because the work that is ongoing is mainly behind the closed doors. And also there's a lot of inconsistencies across official sources. Sometimes they also contradict one another. And therefore, in this very uncertain landscape, we try to provide some clarity, some guidance, and much more transparency in the way the analysis was done. Having said this, I pass now the microphone to my colleague Janine Schluer, who's going to take you through the details of our white paper. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Francesca. So yes, I will dive deeper into our study. As Francesca said, it was very, we started the study and were very motivated and thought that we will find a lot published what the member states are doing right now. But we found out that, of course, there is going on some work behind closed doors, but it's not published yet, and no draft ZEB definition is published or also transferred into national law. So what we did is we looked at the current NZEB, so nearly zero emission building standard, and analyzed how easy it could be transferred to the requirements of the EPBD 2024. And for that, we defined some criterions, which you can see on the right side here, to make a ranking how far the member states are in the ZEB implementation. The first criterion is if there already is a ZEB legal definition adopted in the member state. And for this, no member state get a point. So for every member state, it was 0. The second criterion was if there already is a ban on fossil fuel for space or water heating, or if there is a partial ban, then we said, okay, it's in between, it's 1 point. And the third criterion was if there is any limit for CO2 emissions. So if there is a GHG performance cap included in the actual NZEB requirements in each member state. All these criterion, of course, are based on the EPBD 2024. The fourth criterion was if there is a mandatory use of renewable energy already implemented in the current NZEB status quo. And then the last two criterions were if there is a primary energy threshold in NZEB. So if there is one, they get 1 point. If there is no threshold, then they get 0 points. And the second part of this criterion was how high the threshold or how ambitious the threshold was. And for that, we used a study from the EU Commission and compared the actual threshold in each member state with the recommended benchmark. Yes, and this was the ranking system for the ZEB to get a little bit, more more feeling what we did in the study. Of course, you can read this later in the white paper, but here we wanted to explain it with 2 examples. First example for ban on fossil fuel for space and water heating. Here we used the point system from 2 to 0 points. And for example, Denmark, they are quite advanced. They have already a full ban on fossil fuel in areas with restricted heating in new and also in existing buildings. So we said that they get 2 points because in reality, it's not really possible that a new construction get a fossil fuel heating or something like that. So we said in Denmark, this is a front runner here for this example, and they get 2 points. Another example is Germany. We have a partial ban on fossil fuel. Due to our newest legislation, it is allowed to have a new heating system, which is based on at least 65% renewable energy. So it's not a total ban, but you have to have partial renewable energy. So we say, okay, here, Germany for this criterion get 1 point. And of course, no 0 points would be if there is nothing in the current legislation, so that there could be fossil fuels on site. Another example is the energy threshold. So for that, the ambitious is that the buildings are very good in energy performance, of course. And here you can see a study made by the EU Commission regarding the actual NZEB thresholds in each member state and also the recommended benchmarks. Here in this graphic, you can see 2 blue lines, and these 2 blue lines are between 80 and around 90 up to 100 kilowatt hours per square meter and year. And this is the recommended benchmark. You can see this in the blue lines. And if the threshold from each member state is in between these lines, then it fits to the recommended benchmark from the EU Commission, and then the member states get 1 point for this criterion. If the member state is below, so if the threshold is more ambitious than the recommended benchmark, it would be below. This you can see in the green and yellow graphs for each member state, then the member state gets 2 points. And if it is higher and they have a very high energy threshold right now for the actual NZEB level, then they get 0 points. And for this also we made 3 examples, which you can see on the right side. So Ireland in this example is very ambitious. You can see that Ireland has around 60 kilowatt hours per square meter and year as their actual NZEB level. And the indicative ZEB threshold, which you can see in red, would be 10% minus the actual NZEB level. So it would be compared with the other member states very low. So Ireland gets here 2 points. Then in comparison, Romania is directly between the recommended benchmark. So they get 1 point. And Spain here in this example, there the threshold for the energy threshold for Spain is very high. It is over 170 kilowatt hours per square meter and year. So they get here 0 points. And this is how we ranked each member state regarding to the EU Commission study on the thresholds. Yeah, and so we came to the result that we classified the member states into 3 groups. The first group are the front runners, then a second group of transition movers, and the last group of so-called emerging implementers. The first group, the front runners, are member states which are very ambitious and which we would say are very far in implementing the ZEB requirements, because their actually NZEB legislation is so far that that will be easy to reach. So the front runners in this case are France, Ireland, and Denmark. They have advanced NZEB frameworks. They are partially aligned with the ZEB requirements. And they have a strong foundation for transition. For example, political commitment to phasing out fossil fuel, which is already in their current legislation. Then the transition movers, this is the biggest group of member states. They have moderate NZEB readiness with some challenges to full compliance. There are updates required for key elements, such as GHG limits and stricter energy thresholds, as we could see on the slide before. And then the last group are the group of so-called emerging implementers. These nations are facing structural challenges and significant updates required due to, for example, high energy thresholds, or they have continued fossil fuel use on site, and they have not yet implemented CO2 limits or renewable mandates. So there are still some things to do until they reach the ZEB requirements based on the EPBD 2024. So our key takeaways regarding the ZEB readiness are that first one, implementation status. We say that we found out that no member state has yet fully transposed ZEB into national law. We also found out that there are some front runners. In our study, there are Ireland, France, and Denmark, which already integrated ZEB elements in their existing NZEB standards, so they are quite far. But most of the member states are in transition, so they have partially implemented parts of the EPBD 2024, but key gaps remain. And speaking about these key gaps, for most of the member states, the key gaps are in GHG emission limits in their NZEB standards, are also on-site fossil fuel bans. There are just some countries or some member states which really have this bans. Then a lot of member states have thresholds for primary energy demands. So that's very good. but the absolute values vary. So they, as we could see in the graphic from the EU Commission, there are huge differences between the ambition of the threshold. Then methodology and regional variation. So there is no EU-wide method. So member states apply different approaches based on climate and policy, and this will also continue. And even after the 10% reduction, so if the EPBD say that you have to reduce the energy from NZEB 10% to get ZEB, there will be some member states who have still then very high thresholds compared with the EU recommended thresholds. Yeah, and our outlook is that the acceleration accepted in late 2025 as deadline nears. So for us, it is not, maybe it is a little bit surprising that there is so little information on how far the member states are, but yeah, they still have some time and some time for implementation. And there are early movers which set examples, but full alignment is unlikely completed by May 2026. Yeah, and nearly the same analysis we also did for the key changes to the EPC systems, which the EPBD 2024 requires. So there we also started very ambitious and motivated and thought that we will find a lot on public available information on how far the member states are. But we found out that, of course, there are working groups, there are consultations, but a lot of work is behind closed door. So we also said that now we are looking at the current EPC system and are analyzing how far the current EPC system already is compared with the EPBD 2024 requirements and how easy it is for the member state to transfer their EPC system to the new requirements. And there we also set 6 criterion on how we rank the member states. The first criterion is how the current EPC rating scale is. Francesca said that regarding the EPBD 2024, you have to have a scale from A to G. And if this was fulfilled, then the member state gets a point. If not, and if they have another scale, then they get no point here. The second criterion was on energy efficiency classes, which are expressed in total primary energy use. Then the third criterion was on CO2 emissions indicators, which should be included into the EPCs. And here we had 0 to 2 points. So for some member states, there was a partial implementation. Then criterion number 4 was if there is a EPC database available in the country, or if there is a database, and also if it is public available. And criterion 5 on retrofit roadmaps included in EPC, so which measures should be taken into account for the building to get or to save CO2, to save energy. And the last criterion was if there is also measured data included in the EPC, so that the EPC is not just based on calculated data, which are most of the EPCs, of course, but that there are also the actual measured data of how the building performs. Yeah, and here again we had some examples. Here in this slide you can see on the left side that's how the EPC scales are in the moment over the member states in Europe. So very different in some member states. A B is equal to an D or an F in another member state. So this is far away from a harmonized EPC system over Europe. And on the right-hand side, you can see what the aim of the EPBD is. It is that there is one scale, A to G, optional also 1A+. And there are then numerical benchmarks in which you see exactly, okay, and D, for example, has to be between 150 and 200 kilowatt hours. And here, an example, there are some countries which already have the A2G scale, so they get here 1 point. And there are other countries which don't have the A2G scale yet in the current legislation. For example, Netherlands, they have an A5+ system to G, or Germany. In Germany, we don't have a scale for non-residential buildings at all. So there is some work to do. And here again, like for the ZEB assessment, we classified the member states into 3 groups. First of all, the front runners, then transition movers, and the emerging implementers. The front runners are Ireland and Sweden, which are well on track with the alignment of the EPC systems with the EPBD 2024. So here we can say that the harmonization is nearly completed, so they are very far. Then most of the countries are the transition movers, which have operate functioning EPC systems, but they have some aspects where they have to work on to fit all the EPB requirements, like the scale, which is not A2G, or the content, so that they have to include the CO2 emissions, or the database. So there were some specific aspects which are not fitting right now to the EPC, to the EPBD 2024. And then the last group, emerging implementers, were just a few member states. And these member states have, encountered structural challenges in their EPC system. So they have outdated methodologies, low data quality, or weak enforcement mechanisms. So there is a lot of work to do to fit into the EPBD 2024. And so our key takeaways for the EPC readiness is, again, for the implementation status, that no member state yet has fully transposed the EPC requirements into national law. The front runners are Ireland and Sweden, but the most of the member states have moderate gaps to fulfill the EPBD 2024, and just a few member states are really behind. And the regulatory gap, so what they have to do is the scale. So a lot of member states don't have the A2G scale already. Then many member states have a lack of consistent use of total primary energy use. And also the database is not there in place in every member state. The database there has to be a digital EPC database, and in addition, it has to be public accessible. And we also found out that the retrofit roadmaps has to be improved. Regarding the EPBD, there has to be CO2 factors or CO2 savings into the retrofit roadmaps, and also cost indicators, which many member states are missing right now. And the outlook is quite the same like for ZEB, so that full compliance by 2026 requires legal reforms and robust digital infrastructure, but that preparatory work is underway in many member states, and so the progress is right now in progress. So, Francesca, back to you for the final summary and outlook.
Next slide. We want to keep some time for questions as well. So, as you can see, our focus was on trying to understand the progress. What are the countries right now, the member states in the implementation of the EPBD. And we know there's work ongoing. We spoke to a lot of actors as part of the working groups, but this is not, the results are not publicly available. So the full transposition has not yet taken place. There's a few more months to go, but not many. Many speculate that several countries would not make it in time for May and would ask for extensions. So that could also be possible. From what we've seen, there's a lot of structural changes. For example, the EPBD scale and how new scales would affect existing buildings. This is, again, a major transformation of the building stock. So we need to see how that's going to be achieved. But the full transposition is not there yet. There's a lot of flexibility, of course, that the Commission has given to member states to transpose it into their national contexts, and is to literally mirror their legislative frameworks in place. So we will see still quite a lot of differences within the frame of the EPBD for member states to adapt it to their own context. And going forward, we will see a lot of information coming to us that we will need to be absorbing and interpreting in terms of more clarity and transparency on what is required. And therefore, the last point 4, the guidance that came out only a few weeks ago on 30th of June really provided a lot of more clarity on some of the requirements of the EPBD. In terms of what is expected by the member states to implement into the national transposition plans. And finally, if we go to the next slide, what do we recommend to the EPRA members and to all real estate actors? Well, to keep an eye on monitoring what's going on, because the timeline is very short and there's going to be a lot of changes coming from policymakers. So stay involved as much as possible to industry groups and discussion groups, and keep an eye on what's coming. And try to look at those requirements that are already very clear in terms of zero emission buildings for new construction, and also forward in the future for renovations, and also the changes into the scale of the EPC requirements into your business activities. I would say would be a great thing to start to screen your portfolios for assets that might fall at risk of being falling to mandatory renovations of non-residential buildings that might impact the value and your portfolio strategy. I would say start to look at the front runners, how they are already moving with policy and implementation aligned with the EPBD. I would say one thing that we know is critical in our sector, there is a lack of data. So started to collect data at portfolio and asset level to be able to benchmark portfolios against the requirements for energy efficiency. EPCs often we know they're outdated for portfolios, so update them might be a fantastic thing to do already now. And also to look at this time as a potential competitive advantage. We believe that those that move fast might have a competitive advantage compared to those that are going to wait for the full implementation before they start to act on their portfolios. And with this, we still have 8 minutes to go. Thank you very much for the time and for staying with us. Also at the beginning, we had a few technical issues, but I think we solved them all. And we have already started to answer some of the questions, but we're happy to take more right now.
Hi again. Actually, I think that I can start reading some of the questions. Do you have any insight into whether the EPBD is in any way affected or impacted by the recently proposed omnibus regulation?
I believe not. They're following 2 parallel tracks. This is a directive that has already been published and is in implementation phase in all member states. And the energy efficiency of buildings it's not a new reporting directive. This is, as Lourdes, you showed already, this is the fourth update of a existing legislation. We don't see this being impacted. The only thing I can imagine is that some member states might not be able to transpose in time, and we might see like some latecomers, you know, like or some members that might ask for delay and in the full implementation.
Yes, and actually this is very important because some people expect that the implementation is going to be the full set of new requirements, and no. It's important to keep in mind that it's going to be gradual. Different members, they will start implementing different topics on a different timing. So that is really important and key to understand this process. Okay, so another question. Based on your analysis, how confident are you that there will be EPC harmonization across the EU? Will companies having cross-border portfolios use the same methodology threshold?
Yeah, well, this is a great question because, yes, that's exactly what we see required by the directive, a full harmonization of the EPCs across all the EU countries to enable that cross-border comparison. So having to have the same methodology. That doesn't mean that the scale is exactly the same. There will be countries would have a much higher heating demand, others are cooling demand. So the scale of the categories would need to vary. And that's absolutely important. But the scale itself, A to G, and G being worst performing buildings, A being a ZEB building, A plus being 20% above NZEB, that, as far as we know, as far as we understand, is exactly the goal.
Yes, and here also I would like to add that in this point also the European Commission give a lot of freedom and is going to adapt to each member state regulation. So it's very important also to check which member states are more advanced to learn from them.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
they are defining largely what's going to happen at EU level.
Yes.
Okay, so one more question. Do you know who is engaging and representing listed real estate sector interests and views with the respective national governments in relation to the transposition of the EPBD by member states?
Lourdes, this is almost for EPRA on the listed real estate sector's interests.
So actually, there is no one single body in charge of this. As we are talking about very technical topics, there are specialists, like even academics, different type of bodies working on this. They provide most of the information studies on the Build Up platform from the European Commission that is accessible to everyone. And it also varies a lot member states, because in some member states, for example, these competencies are at national level. In some countries, for example, like in Spain, each comunidad autónoma has their own competence in this topic, so it's kind of depends a lot. So the answer is no. We don't know which exact body is in charge for this, because actually there isn't only one body. There are multiple bodies, and it differs a lot by country.
Yeah. Also, last question on how do we make sure that different experts from different countries come to the same EPC level? So there's national working groups, and then there's like European working groups. There are a series of facilitated exchanges that have already started to take place in the past between the European working groups and the Commission. So there's also not only a national level groups developing, and taking in the guidance from the Commission, but also the Commission is facilitating that exchange. And we spoke to the World Green Building Council, for example. They explained how this is already happening. So that continuous communication is something that we will see also happening in the next months.
Yes. Okay, so maybe the last question. Any efforts to standardize the EPCs in the member states and make it unseeable across different countries at EU level? I think this is similar to the previous one.
Yeah, exactly. EPCs, and then as a final question, I mean, if you keep on getting the question, we will reply and send a written answer to all of you, because there's a minute to go. On the conversion factors, there's guidance that was just published on the 30th of June on the EPC's calculation, and there's a specific article on clarity on the conversion factors. So there's a guidance coming from the Commission on this.
Yeah. And in the last part of the report, we briefly mentioned the new specification introduced by the Commission the 30th of June. Okay, so I think we can wrap up. Thank you so much to the KPMG team, Francesca, Janine. Thank you so much to all the attendees. Hope you enjoyed the webinar, and we will post the presentation in EPRA website and the report as well to those who didn't manage to access to it. Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.